Hi, I'm Liz Zumpe, and I'm a faculty member at the University of Oklahoma in Ed Leadership and Policy Studies. And I've been involved in design-based school improvement for over a decade. It started when I was first developing this method with Rick Mintrop at the University of California, Berkeley. And he was then director of their EDD program. And at that time, I was a fresh doc student out of my classroom experience from over a decade working in urban public schools. And I think because of that, it sort of had exposed me, working in a variety of different schools with different needs and different communities, to the range of realities that's facing educators in the real world of schools, and also the challenges of trying to figure out how to solve our problems of practice. So I worked in schools that were challenging places where you were kind of on your own and you didn't necessarily have the benefit of having a strong leader there to guide you through continuous improvement. And I also worked in places where we did have that and we were working together and we were solving our problems of practice. And I experienced how joyful that could be. So for me, design based school improvement kind of came in as we started asking this question of how could we get more schools to be these kinds of thriving places of continuous improvement where people feel a sense of collective agency to solve their meaningful and authentic problems of practice. And so for me, the experience was really transformative. And my goal or our goal with design-based school improvement has always been to figure out not so much how to create the perfect model that could be replicated, but actually how do we understand this puzzle of what fosters people's collective agency in schools to solve their problems of practice. Design-based school improvement, or what we often call by the acronym DIPSY, it's a set of practices for collaborative problem solving in schools. Foundationally, it's about understanding problem solving as a way to unleash collective agency, or what we think about as the capability of people to work together to accomplish tasks and solve their problems. It's also something we think about as more of a logic and a set of practices. And it's kind of oriented to guide teams in how to unleash their own self determined learning around a problem of practice. So it usually starts with figuring out what is our problem of practice and what is our theory of action for how to address that problem of practice. So within this set of practices, you would do things like, as a group of people working in a school, what is a shared priority that we want to address around here? What's something that we think really needs improving? And in Dipsy, we often start not so much with looking at data to answer that question, but looking at the subjectively perceived needs and urgencies of the people in the school. We assume that these are where you're going to find like the energy that you need and the juice to really drive improvement forward. But because those kinds of needs are often pretty broad and fuzzy, then Dipsy also walks people through how to then take that and transform these fuzzy problems in that exist often in what Donald Schoen calls the swampy lowlands of real world problems, right? Well, the swampy, fuzzy problems aren't necessarily always great in terms of motivating us to take action and feeling a sense of agency to take action. So, also a step in Dipsy that we take is how do we make those fuzzy concerns that we have turn into like a really concrete and actionable problem of practice? And for us, we take the word practice very seriously. So we're really thinking about what are we routinely doing and saying around here that we think needs changing? How do we name that in a way that makes us ground the problem in the practices that we see in the organization? And then we have to try to understand, well, what's causing that? If that's something we think that needs changing, how do we diagnose that? What are some of the root causes around that? And because some of those root causes, a lot of times for the problems of practice that we face, are not all things that are within our control. A lot of these are problems are systemic. So part of what we do in Dipsy is we think about, okay, you're going to diagnose your root causes, but you're also going to think of all the root causes that you've come up with, which are the ones that are in your locus of control or your sphere of influence, so that you're kind of setting yourself on a path to actually see that you could do something about the problem that you're facing. So then once you have an idea of what is your problem, what might be causing it, where you might have a sphere of influence over addressing it, then you also need to think about, okay, we need a goal, we need a direction. So we try to think about helping people set a realistic goal. So understanding where are we at point A with this problem and where would we be at point B, let's say 6, 8 weeks from now. What would that look like if things had improved? And then in order for us to think about how we're going to reach that goal, then we have to start thinking about how does change happen? What drives change? And so in our case, we are really emphasizing thinking about not just resources that you could bring to bear to solve the problems that we face, but also like the motivational drivers that are there. So we think about things like efficacy or a sense of competence or people feeling a sense of belonging and how to make sure we incorporate that into our idea of how to get the change across. And then also we also think about like what are the assets that we have to draw on in our organization, in the people that we have in our organization, in the resources we have in our organization. And sometimes that involves taking a cue from things like appreciative inquiry, which is another type of improvement approach that comes out of positive psychology, and think about what might be our positive core as an organization, the values and the peak experiences that really show us that we have what it takes to solve our problems around here. And so then all of those things come together and represent this is your theory of what you think the problem is, what's causing it, and how you're going to change it. And from there, you would go and do some iterative cycles of inquiry. And as a team, kind of think about okay, what's a practical measure that we could use to see if we're making a difference on that problem? And how do we learn from our results so we can get better at solving this problem over time? So, with that said, I would just like to acknowledge that many of the things that I just laid out about Dipsy might sound familiar because we see it as a cousin to many other improvement methods. But one of the things that I would say makes it a little bit different is that the idea of really kind of thinking about how people learn and grounding that coming out of the design-based tradition of thinking about people's agency and how people learn and thinking about designing unique, contextually specific solutions that address those people's needs. Design-based school improvement usually is intended to happen amongst groups of adults that are working inside schools or inside school districts. This can involve teachers in their own classrooms. This could also involve teams of teachers in schools, often school leaders. It could also involve district leaders. And also, the work usually benefits from involving outside partners. So it can also be involving university partners, particularly if those university partners bring some expertise in design based problem solving or related improvement approaches. And so, really, we were developing those approaches first as a method for how, when we first were developing in an EDD program. So, we were thinking about leaders who are using these methods as a means for doing their dissertations and transforming the way we think about a dissertation for the education doctorate away from sort of generalizable research that we usually would think about for a PhD and towards more practice focused research where we're thinking about the dissertation as a means for leaders to develop inquiry based leadership skills and bring research to bear on solving real world problems of practice. So if you're in a doc program, then the partnering aspect might look like your committee and your university instructors are partnering with your thinking because you're taking classes in methods and theories, and you have a chair, right? And then you would be encouraged as an education leader pursuing that doctorate to also collaborate with people inside your organizations. So you wouldn't necessarily be thinking about this as something you're doing completely on your own. You would be thinking about this as you need to have a design team that you're convening and working with inside your organization. But after we did this for a while at the ed doctorate level, we also started wondering, well, how are people doing with learning Dipsy and, using it? And we started to study our own program. And one of the things we figured out is, oh, they're really having a hard time understanding the logic of Dipsy. And why? Well, one of the things we figured out in analyzing how they were learning it and how they were trying to think about it is that there was a different kind of mindset that was already there, that had been cultivated in the institutional and organizational environments that leaders tend to work in. And so we started to think, okay, so you can't necessarily always get people to understand and use a design based approach if that's not the way their systems are set up. And it's not so easy necessarily to learn how to do that from the distance of the university. So then we thought, well, let's take the show on the road and let's try to figure out how you could do Dipsy more in the real world of schools and districts. And this is where we really started to use this process to think about, okay, so how would you adapt something that at a doctorate level might involve people taking a lot of classes, maybe like a really slower process where it could take up to a year for you to think about your problem of practice and your theory of action, and you're bringing all kinds of literature to bear, versus in job embedded contexts where you are bringing a school team together and they just don't have that kind of time. And they might feel urgency to try to solve their problems today. And they might already have some things cooking. They're not necessarily blank slates. They've already been trying to solve their problems. And so it really put us more in this position of thinking about, in terms of like who's involved and how the work is done, thinking about this as an adaptive process and a developmental process. So it's really meant for school teams working with people who could be sort of expert facilitators, but it also needs to be adapted to whoever are the learners are. Because even if you say school teams or if you say district teams, there's so many different contexts that are facing district leaders and school leaders out there, depending on where you are. So it really kind of needs to be adapted to the context. Design-based school improvement was designed with education leaders in mind. And it was designed with education leaders in mind, thinking about them working with their stakeholders. And when we imagine that, we're particularly thinking about the people who are on the front lines inside of schools and districts. Although that doesn't mean you couldn't involve and couldn't benefit from involving parents and students and other stakeholders. And we have seen efforts where people bring more diverse stakeholders in. The ideas of design based school improvement were really kind of rooted in trying to understand educators' realities in their working conditions and how they might think about solving problems considering those working conditions and the types of practices that you are engaged in as educators. Design based school improvement is a good approach when you are facing complex problems for which you don't have a ready made solution. And particularly if you are in a school where you're concerned with whether or not there really does seem to be a sense of collective agency amongst the people in the school to want to solve our own problems. I think that's where Dipsy could have an edge sometimes over some of the other improvement models that are out there. So one of the things that we found is that oftentimes when leaders try to go about solving their problems of practice, they think about it through their own lens as leaders with their own solutions, and they think about a program or solution they already have in mind that they want to implement. So, one of the things that can come up when people are trying to solve problems in schools through this implementation orientation is you hear this constant complaint of resistance. There's all this resistance to change. And so, what Dipsy really comes in and says to those folks is maybe actually there's something about the way people have been encouraged to really focus on program implementation that's taking you away from understanding the needs and concerns of the people that are in your organization and thinking about what's going to motivate them to want to change. So Dipsy can be really good if you are in a school where you're thinking like, hey, we've been trying implementing these best practices, which is great, but we still have that 30% of teachers that just don't want to do it, right? Or like every time we try to work on improvement, it's like everyone's digging their heels in. That can be an indicator of like there's a challenge there for that collective agency to actually want to change and improve. And some of the practices in Dipsy are intended to help people move past that. I think it also could be really helpful in contexts where people have started to use more of a data-driven approach. So, particularly in the United States context, that's been a strong push for a few decades now. And in some places, it's taken root, and people are really firmly thinking about improvement as something they do that's driven by data. But sometimes what we found is that when that happens, not all the data that people are thinking about is really rooted in the types of experiences that are involved in the problems that educators are facing. These tend to be hard to capture in data because they're about like relationships and sort of interactions that are ongoing. So often, like sometimes in schools that are using more data driven approaches, they might find that at some point they can only go so far with that. They kind of hit a sticking point. So Dipsy might be helpful if he's like, well, we've tried that approach. Let's try Dipsy because actually it gives us a different starting point for thinking about inquiry rather than start with necessarily what's in the data per se. We start by talking with people and finding out what it is that they think needs to be addressed and kind of moving from there. And that different starting point sometimes can open up a new way of learning together than maybe the data driven approaches have done. There's also many contexts where the data-driven approaches have been experienced as kind of punitive and top-down. And so, Dipsy can be great for like kind of experience in a more liberatory kind of way if that is your context. And you're feeling like, I can't even get people to want to do anything because they're very scared of data or they're scared of this whole idea of improvement because they feel like they've been maybe battered down by some of the accountability system pressures, then Dipsy can sometimes be a good entry point because it is more about thinking about the problems that people find meaningful and want to change. Design-based school improvement works best when there is already some kind of strategic orientation already established in the organization. So, for example, maybe some kind of strategic plan that's already in place at the district level, maybe some kind of effort to have created some kind of coherence around that strategic plan. And I would say also where there's a culture that people, especially people at the top levels of leadership, are encouraging experimentation and learning. And that's not always the case. Sometimes you have people who are in top levels of leadership who may have a more overbearing kind of top down approach that isn't encouraging people to venture out into investigating their problems of practice and experimenting with new innovative practices. So it kind of works better when you have at least some folks who are in positions of authority that are encouraging that orientation and rewarding people for wanting to experiment with their learning. I also think it's really important for people to, or it works best when there's someone in the organization that can help you with some skilled facilitation. Because, like I was saying earlier, this doesn't necessarily come easy to folks, right? This isn't the way we're usually used to thinking about solving problems in schools where things work at a really fast pace and maybe you feel a lot of pressure and it's not always easy to get people to come together and want to go through an iterative process of solving problems together. So I think having somebody who can be a facilitator is helpful for creating that, and also because, as I was mentioning earlier, it works best when you think about it less like a model and more like a repertoire. And the reason is because people face so many different contextual needs that it's very hard to introduce something that you consider a model that you feel like you have to work through step by step without it turning into yet one more program we're trying to implement and one more set of procedures that we're trying to learn. So it works best when you have skilled facilitators who actually know the context and can think, okay, so where is this school at? And what are its current capacities? What are its current challenges? What would take us to our next level of work for our collective agency? Kind of what are we stuck on and what are we strong in? And sort of having Dipsy more like in your back pocket as a bunch of tools that you can use to further the collective agency of your group, but not necessarily always think you have to walk them through a comprehensive set of steps to get from the part to the next. One of the biggest challenges in enacting design-based school improvement is just pretty much the same set of challenges that faces any kind of continuous improvement effort, which is that schools often have limited resources and time for doing any kind of innovative work or collective learning together. Also, a lot of schools tend to be places where there's turnover, where you don't always have the right kind of leadership for the right kind of learning that you want to do, and you don't always necessarily have the right kind of culture in place. So I think one of the challenges of enacting Dipsy is that it kind of has to be able to take place in a context that might not be perfectly suited to it. And that's probably why we've moved more in this direction of thinking about it in terms of a repertoire and a set of practices that you can adapt, because that set of conditions just so rarely exists that you just have abundant time and resources, low turnover, And then I could talk a little bit about the issue of trust, which is, I could sit here and say, oh, yeah, and you should be in a high trust organization. So you could just skip that part. But actually, I think that what we found is engaging in Dipsy can be a way, especially if you do it adaptively, of fostering trust. And the reason is because you can help people recognize shared challenges that they have. You can help people formulate goals that they feel are attainable. And so by feeling like we could actually develop a sense of collective agency as a group, you can foster that trust. But if you don't have that as a starting point, you have to know that. And that has to be factored into the way you adapt it. I'd say one of the unique challenges for Gypsy that may not be the same for all improvement models is also one of its potential benefits, which is this emphasis on collective agency and felt needs. And so, as in some contexts, this is experienced in a very liberatory kind of way, like, oh, we're freed from just focusing on what the accountability system is asking us. We're freed from just this focus on data and what's in the data and talking to each other to figure out what we really feel is important. But that is also where it can be challenging because not all contexts are open to that way of thinking. So, if you're in a place where we're actually not used to having these kinds of conversations with each other, or actually, we've had some success with being really data driven, and we're not so open to, or maybe we're a little skeptical of the idea of going with subjectively perceived felt needs of people. Like, is that even really a valid starting point for inquiry? Is that a good way to do the learning? And also, there can be some interesting differences that raise different kinds of challenges depending on the national context. So, I have also had the opportunity to collaborate with some folks who are working on Dipsy in Germany, for example. And in that context, you don't have the same kind of tradition of sort of the principal as the manager of the school and the idea of teacher evaluation, which has created some kind of more press in the United States context towards this idea that you should be thinking about improvement and you should be thinking about innovation. This is a more relatively new thing that's arisen in the German context. And so you still have in the German context very strong norms of teacher autonomy, even stronger than in the United States. So the idea of how are we even going to convince a group of teachers who really work like almost like independent contractors to come together and want to collaborate on around a problem of practice, and who would lead that? Who has the authority, the leadership authority, or the influence to even do that is a question mark. And in some contexts, you also see there can be some cautiousness around data and thinking about using results as a matter for learning, because that is not something that has necessarily been pressed upon the German educational culture in the same way as in the United States. So, sometimes people don't really aren't really convinced that that's the right way to go. And then I would say one other challenge that can come up is I was talking earlier about how it would be really powerful if you have in Dipsy a group of people who are working together. And what makes the learning even more powerful is if that's a cross functional group. So you have people who are in different parts of the organization working together. Let's say school leaders working with teachers, or school leaders and teachers working with district leaders. And then potentially you could even be adding university partners, community partners, or parents, or even students into that mix. So that all is great potentially because you're bringing all these diverse forms of expertise into the mix so we can actually get better at solving our problems. But it's not so easy to create this kind of cross-functional group because there's power dynamics that are going to be involved. And if you really want to proceed from the felt needs of people, then people have to feel safe to express those felt needs if they're sitting in a group of people that may actually have some kind of status or power over them. So we have found the need to also think about when you're in those kinds of cross-functional situations, how you're going to make it safe. So, for example, we have experimented with protocols where people would, instead of talking with each other to find out their urgencies and needs, might write them down on a piece of paper anonymously, and we put them all into a box, and then we sort them and analyze them so that you would actually have the potential for people to put things down they might not feel safe to say directly to somebody. The advice I would give to someone who wants to get started with Dipsy is first, you could read the original book that we published about the model by Harvard Ed Press in 2016. You could also read an article that Rick Mintrop and I wrote about our analysis of education leaders learning these problem solving skills and the challenge of cultivating a problem solving mindset. That was published in the American Journal of Education. Um, the reason why I could say you could start with those readings is because they both offer you the vision of what these practices could be looking like if you've done them in a really deep and rigorous way, as well as why it's not so easy and you don't want to go into the work assuming like we could just go implement Dipsy tomorrow. There's actually some deeper change that is involved and some deeper learning that's involved in that. So, I would also say, like, if you're trying to get started with this, think about partnering with somebody who has some experience with Dipsy or something similar to Dipsy. Because I was saying earlier, it's usually something that people have a hard time kind of learning on their own because it runs counter to a lot of the ways that we think about improvement. So it's helpful to find somebody who might be a partner who could facilitate for you, and ideally, someone who's a partner that can facilitate for you, who might actually be willing to stick with you for the long term and actually really understand the context and understand the people so that you could think about it more like as something in your back pocket. So I would start looking for who that partner could be. And then whoever that partner is, so whoever's looking to get started with Dipsy and also who they're looking for in the partner and thinking about that process, I would say one of the first things to do is to think about how would you informally assess the current state of things in your organization when you think about the capacities that are there and when you think about, the extent of collective agency that's there. So do you think that you have really strong collective agency already? Oh, yeah, we have teams that meet all the time, leadership teams, cross functional teams, teacher teams. They're doing inquiry, they're doing data. We're thriving when it comes to that. Okay, so then what are you stuck on? What is it that design based school improvement might help you with that you're not necessarily able to do yet? For example, maybe you are thriving around data driven decision making, but there's something that you haven't quite figured out how to solve yet. Maybe it has something to do with the way you're defining the problem. Maybe Dipsy could help you with thinking about how to define your problem more in terms of practices instead of the way that oftentimes data might define it in terms of sort of downstream outcomes of our practices. Or let's say you think about that question I just posed and you're like, oh no, actually, we barely work together at all in this school or in this district. And we're kind of struggling with those basics of just teaming. Then you might say, okay, so Dipsy could still help you, but you don't necessarily start with maybe a problem of practice. Maybe you start with what I was describing earlier around helping people think about what is our positive core and where might we find that we have the potential and the resources to do something around here by looking at where we have had our bright spots and where we have had successes as an organization. So I'd say really kind of thinking through where do you think the organization currently is and what are you stuck on so that you could think about where could Dipsy help you in your next level of work versus trying to go about it necessarily by kind of implementing it like a model. Having said all of that, I also want to acknowledge that sometimes people have a hard time thinking about it as a repertoire before they've really experienced it as a sequence of steps. So there's absolutely no harm as well if you want to get started with Dipsy in like, let's just try the sequence of steps. Let's try it all out, see how it goes, learn along the way. And then if once we have experienced it, we could start thinking about where we could fold pieces of it into our other improvement work that we already have going on.